customers. Closing these gaps will require effective infrastructure finance for rural areas, especially in the absence of market incentives for private firms. For instance, the US Reconnect program has made $700 million in grants and loans available to connect thousands of rural residents, farmers, and business owners to reliable, affordable, high-speed internet. At the same time, cities' infrastructure requirements will also grow to accommodate their growing populations. Our recent report for the G20 on financing the cities of tomorrow sets out how they can leverage private investment and sustainable finance to meet those infrastructure needs. Third, by providing the right skills and job opportunities in regional labor markets. Governments must capitalize on their regional assets and their human capital to incentivize the development of firms and of their local economy. To do so, they need to ensure the availability of training, education, and employment services that cater to the current and potential needs of the local labor market. They can also foster entrepreneurship and innovation by small and medium-sized businesses, including those with social business models. Fourth, by improving the quality of multi-level governance systems. Clear, well-defined responsibilities for national, regional, and local governments can help prevent the duplication of efforts and prevent gaps in the design of regional policies. The trend is in the direction of decentralization, which is very much welcome. And asymmetric approaches where the responsibilities assigned to subnational governments will vary based on their size and capacity. So decentralization is good. Asymmetric approaches with responsibilities assigned to subnational governments based on their size and capacity is obviously a way to flexibly respond to local requirements. But decentralization should, however, be accompanied with close cooperation between different levels of government. There can be significant scale advantages when more remote and less populous regions coordinate their procurement, transportation, planning, and other activities. But in Lithuania, for example, introduced legislative amendments in 2020 to ensure a regional policy is based on economic and labor market patterns rather than segmented exclusively by municipal boundaries. Fifth, by strengthening capacity at the national and subnational levels. Not all subnational governments have the same ability to design, finance, and implement regional development policies. To enhance capacity, this outlook highlights the importance of skills development for local administrators, combined with sufficient revenue-raising capacity for subnational governments to make investments and deliver services. The Ministry of Regional Development of the Czech Republic, for example, or Czechia, created a web-based application to support municipalities in designing their municipal development strategies. The OECD recommendation on regional development policy adopted earlier this year can support the implementation of this roadmap with guidance on the design, focus, governance, and financing of regional development policies. The OECD will be developing a practical toolkit to support its implementation, and will use the recommendation to support reviews of regional development policy frameworks in OECD member countries and beyond. We very much look forward to continuing to work with governments at all levels to help regions make the most of their local potential and the potential of their local human capital. With that, I hand the floor to Lamia to present the report in some more detail. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Secretary General, and good morning, everyone. My great pleasure, of course, to present some of the findings, more detailed findings emerging from this Regional Outlook 2030, building, of course, on the Secretary General presentation. So First, let me start by talking about the large regional income disparities that prevail in many OECD countries. When we measure regional inequalities, of course, the scale matters. And generally, we look at large administrative regions, state regions, provinces, landers, but for which report we have done something differently. We have compiled 20 years of GDP per capita data for what we call small regions, which are close to the geography where people live and work. And we did that for 27 countries for which data is available, which can provide us with a more granular picture of regional inequalities. And as you can see here on the slide, in many countries like France, UK, United States, Italy, as well as from Eastern Europe, income per capita in the richest 20% of regions is more than twice that of the 20% poorest. And it can go up to around 3 times in countries like Turkey, Slovak Republic, and Poland. And even in the countries with the smallest gaps, like New Zealand and Japan on the right side of the chart, income per capita in the richest regions are 40% higher than in the poorest. So, taking now a long-term perspective, over the last 20 years, we found around half of OECD countries have seen widening regional income inequalities. And this is despite several decades of convergence between countries. You can see here on the slide, distinct a group of countries showing different paths. In the top right, you see a bunch of high-income countries with widening regional income inequalities, including France, UK, US, Belgium, Japan, Denmark, and Sweden. Below that, you can see a group of countries that have been converging toward the OECD average income per capita, but that have also seen regional inequalities increase. And this is the case of most Eastern European countries. Then turning to the left-hand side of this slide, we have countries that narrowed regional income inequalities, with some of them in the context of relatively weak economic growth, like Greece, Portugal, and Spain. And this is actually a story about the underperformance of their richer regions, the so-called downward convergence scenario. But we are particularly interested in a fourth group of countries in the mid and top left, countries with relatively high level of GDP per capita or converging to the OECD average, and that succeeded in narrowing regional inequalities. Here we have Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, but also Korea and Turkey. So what we can see here in this slide is that we have really different trajectories, and each of these countries has a different story, and they have also a different set of drivers that can explain these trends. So obviously, productivity differences across regions are a significant driver. We know that economic structure of a region determines its fortune, but the productivity story is not just a story about which sector a region is specialized in. So in addition to attracting firms in new sectors to boost regional productivity, we should also need to address gaps in access to skills, access to market, access to finance, infrastructure, and services. Another point that I want to show you here in this slide is that higher productivity does not always result in better employment outcomes across different types of regions. And you can see here from the chart, for instance, that while productivity in metropolitan regions typically goes hand in hand with job growth, some regions, especially far from metropolitan regions, succeeded in raising productivity, but also they lost jobs due to different factors: technological change, trade, globalization, technology change, for instance, more automation in manufacturing, mining, and agriculture in some regions. So we should pay more attention to factors that undermine access to markets and economic opportunities in lagging regions. Again, skills, infrastructure, public services. And here comes the story about metropolitan regions pulling away over the last 2 decades. Actually, differences in GDP per capita between large metropolitan regions and other regions account for the largest share of regional income inequality in most countries. This is due to agglomeration effect, the density factors, higher productivity driven by shared infrastructure, better matching of workers with jobs and knowledge spillovers. And here on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that population growth has been much faster in metropolitan region, and this is especially true for the largest metropolitan region here in dark blue, which grew by almost 20%, twice as much as non-metropolitan region. And you can also see large metropolitan region pulling away from other regions in GDP growth in the chart on the right. So today, on average, metropolitan region across the OECD have around 32% higher GDP per capita than other type of regions. So of course, everybody will say, well, the metropolitan regions are the big winners. It's true. But we should also remember that this comes with cost, including in providing infrastructure, housing, transport, tackling congestion and inequalities. All this emphasizes the need for targeted policy also in successful places. So, of course, the flip side of growing metropolitan region is that many other places are shrinking. This is a big problem in rural areas, especially in remote regions. Over the last 2 decades, nearly 40% of remote regions in the OECD shrunk. As more young people move to cities, remote regions are also aging. These are the regions with the highest share of old age dependency ratios, above 50%. And shrinking is also now becoming more and more a problem for mid-sized metropolitan region represented here in purple. We have seen that 21% of them saw their population shrink over the last 2 decades. And unfortunately, we can expect many more regions to shrink in the years to come, as shown in the projection to 2040 in the right-hand side. This is a big concern. This is an increasing concern for many countries. Shrinking undermines local public revenues, pushes up the cost of maintaining public infrastructure and services, and create also a need to tackle dereliction and brand, which can be costly to fix. So this geography of inequalities stretches well beyond economic outcome. And as you can see in this chart, the share of adults with tertiary education is larger in cities than in rural areas, in all OECD countries, actually, with a gap that can go over 25 percentage points in Hungary and Slovak Republic. And this gap, unfortunately, has been increasing in 3/4 of countries in the last decade. Part of this is due to migration of highly educated workers to cities, but also it's due to more difficulties in access to quality education early in life in rural regions. And for example, the OECD PISA study shows that in 2020, students in city schools obtain higher reading scores in all OECD countries. This is a result of poor access as well as difficulties in attracting good teachers in rural areas. So there are similar gaps in health. Travel times to healthcare obviously are much larger, 5 times larger actually in remote rural area than in cities. Beyond distance, the gap in the availability of hospital beds per capita between metropolitan region and remote regions, which stood at 50% in 2020. This gap has been increasing since the global financial crisis, as you can see in this chart. And again, this is likely to contribute to an equal outcome for non-metropolitan region, which can be addressed in several ways. For instance, by offering different type of related services in a single location, expanding telemedicine and developing digital shared mobility services. And we also see an urban-rural divide in digital infrastructure. That's quite impressive here. On average, across OECD countries, a third of households in rural areas do not have access to high-speed broadband. And this gap in digital access reduces opportunities for rural areas, including in remote working and telemedicine. And it's not there on the slide, but there is also a big gap in digital skills between metropolitan areas and non-metropolitan areas. So all these type of disparities in different type of outcomes, non-economic outcomes, health, education, digital, all these disparities are well connected. When public services and infrastructure are of poor quality, it is much harder for lagging regions to attract and retain the people, the skills, and the investment that are really needed to break a vicious cycle of decline. So, big question, is it okay to live with high spatial inequalities? Well, the cost of inaction may be too high to ignore. Economic cost, the contribution of lagging regions to national economies is sizable in aggregate terms. Social costs, spatial inequalities undermine social mobility, leading to a higher welfare dependency. And we are talking more and more about political cost and the geography of discontent linked with rising spatial inequalities. And the chart that I'm showing now on the screen is about, it showed the wide gaps in trust in government across regions. In the OECD, we're working a lot on trust in government at national and local level. At the local level, it's generally much higher than at the national level. But here we can see a lot of disparities between regions. And in our work, actually, we have seen that regions in long-term economic decline or high unemployment often have a lower level of trust in their government. And this is also true in regions where people feel they have lower standards of public services than in other regions, especially in healthcare and education. So looking forward, the future, the twin transition, everybody's talking about that. Maybe I need to go back to one slide. Yes. I was talking about the twin transition, digital and green. They may widen regional disparities again. We have already seen how gaps in digital infrastructure may leave non-metropolitan regions behind. In the green transition too, prospects differ sharply across regions, with lagging regions, the ones tending to lose out. Metropolitan regions have higher share of green jobs, especially capital cities, because a lot of green jobs are concentrated in high-skilled professions like research, architecture, and engineering, while we may expect rural areas to benefit from investment in renewable energy. These activities tend to be highly automated, created few jobs. So we also find that poorer regions tend to have a higher share of polluting jobs at risk from the green transition. Again, here you have the map of Europe and the United States, but in the report, we're covering many other OECD countries, almost all, I think, for this type of indicators. We have seen that across OECD countries, only 2.3% of employment is in sectors that are at risk for some of losing employment due to the green transition. But within countries, we have some regions which can have 3 times the share of employment at risk. I see here Italy's Liguria or Poland's Silesia, but in some other works that we're doing, we have identified many other regions. Actually, if you go at a more disaggregated level, you can see that some communities can be hugely impacted. So this region will need to be supported through proactive place-based policy if we are to ensure a just transition. So what should we do? Well, against a backdrop of global shocks and transition, there is really a need for stronger, tailored, and more adaptable place-based policy that allows all types of regions to benefit from this change, but also to strengthen their resilience. How to do it? Don't be disappointed. There is no silver bullet. We know that. Regions often struggle, not just on one front, but on many. And there are different patterns of regional inequalities at different scales, shaped by different national contexts. So the key message of this report is that all this requires a mix of action that we have reflected in the 5 key priorities that were already presented by the Secretary General, and you will find more information in the report. So I'm going to stop here, but I want to show you the last slide, which show you that actually in the report and online, you can find all the country profile, the 38 country profile that are included in the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lamia. And now we'll open up the floor to questions from the press in the room and on the Zoom chat. I'll call first on la tribune.
Bonjour, merci pour cette présentation. Donc, Grégoire Normand, La Tribune. J'avais une question concernant la place de la France dans les pays de l'OCDE. Comment se situe l'Hexagone par rapport aux autres pays du point de vue des inégalités régionales? Merci.
Alors, merci beaucoup pour votre question. Je vais répondre en français. Vous avez vu dans le slide, en fait, la France fait partie de ces pays qui ont connu une hausse des inégalités territoriales. Et ici, en France, elles sont mesurées au niveau des départements. C'est l'unité qui est la plus proche de l'unité d'analyse qu'on a choisie pour ces petites régions. Donc, à l'instar de la Belgique, des États-Unis, du Royaume-Uni, de la Suède, du Danemark et du Japon, on a vu une hausse des inégalités territoriales. En France, en fait, après, évidemment, chaque pays, comme je l'ai mentionné, a différentes trajectoires. Mais en France, en gros, on peut dire que Paris et le désert, c'est plus vraiment le cas. Mais Paris reste fortement continue de concentrer beaucoup de population et de richesses. Mais en fait, c'est beaucoup plus nuancé. On peut voir plusieurs tendances. La première, c'est qu'il y a aussi quand même un fort déclin de la région nord-est qui a subi le contre-coup de la désindustrialisation. On a des ressorts de croissance qui font défaut dans pas mal de villes moyennes et des territoires ruraux. Et une forte inégalité au sein des métropoles. Voilà. Donc, en fait, on a différentes trajectoires, différentes images des inégalités territoriales en France qui sont très, très importantes à adresser. Donc, on a beaucoup travaillé sur la France, en fait, dans d'autres études qui ne sont pas forcément mentionnées. Et ce qu'on peut voir, en fait, c'est que la France, il y a des expériences de politique régionale et de politique territoriale qui ont inspiré énormément d'autres pays, notamment tous les dispositifs qui ont été mis en place par le biais de contrats territoriaux. Ça a inspiré, ça a été dupliqué dans pas mal de pays. Peut-être, moi, j'aimerais dire un mot sur ce qui passe en ce moment, en fait, toute la question du renouveau des politiques industrielles et peut-être l'idée de davantage territorialiser les politiques industrielles, puisque ça aura un impact énorme sur pas mal de territoires. C'est déjà le cas à travers certains mécanismes, je pense au territoire d'industrie. On a suivi ce mécanisme, il y a des études qui ont été faites là-dessus. Peut-être davantage utiliser cette expérience très innovante des territoires d'industrie peut-être l'utiliser à plus grande échelle. Donc ça, mais la France s'est attaquée au problème du digital, du numérique, des écarts entre les régions, avec des fonds considérables. Donc, le plan haut débit en France, il y a énormément d'argent qui vont permettre ce rattrapage d'ailleurs assez rapide. Mais il y a aussi pas mal d'actions qui sont faites en faveur des zones un peu, disons, intermédiaires, des petites et moyennes villes. Je pense au cœur des villes, le plan d'action cœur des villes. Donc, il y a tout un tas de dispositifs. Peut-être quelques recommandations. Évidemment, le secrétaire général l'a mentionné très clairement, la question de la décentralisation à poursuivre partout et en France. Les dernières lois qui ont été mises en place, la loi MAPTAN et Neutre, ont permis d'avancer, de créer des régions. Mais maintenant, il va falloir leur donner les moyens et d'opérationnaliser ce qui a été décidé dans la loi. Il y a pas mal de régions, en fait, il y a encore un travail à faire. Mieux clarifier les différents domaines de compétences entre les niveaux de gouvernement et évidemment l'éternelle question des 34 000 communes, le millefeuille institutionnel. Pourquoi je mentionne ça? C'est qu'en fait, que ce soit en France ou ailleurs, la question institutionnelle est pratiquement aussi importante que la question des politiques, la nature des politiques. On peut avoir de très bonnes politiques, mais si on n'a pas derrière des institutions qui fonctionnent en coordination et en lien avec les acteurs essentiels sur le territoire, on ne peut pas délivrer les résultats qu'on voudrait obtenir.
Merci, Lamia. On a une deuxième question en français de Marine Loulcet pour France TV. Qu'est-ce qui explique les différents modèles d'évolution des inégalités régionales dans les pays de l'OCDE?
OK, je réponds en français. OK. En fait, évidemment, il y a différentes explications derrière ces différentes trajectoires. D'abord, il faut voir que certains pays ont des formes beaucoup plus polycentriques, alors que d'autres pays ont des formes beaucoup monocentriques. Et on voit bien que des pays comme, par exemple, la France ou même les États-Unis, où en fait, leur croissance est basée sur quelques métropoles, alors que dans d'autres pays où on a une forme beaucoup plus polycentrique, on a un rattrapage qui se fait de manière plus rapide. Donc, la question de la forme, de la polycentricité, évidemment, ce n'est pas quelque chose qu'on peut changer, mais ça a un impact. Ensuite, il y a d'autres facteurs. Il y a des facteurs qui sont liés, comme je l'ai dit, beaucoup aux écarts en termes d'opportunités qui existent entre les différents territoires. Il y a des pays aussi qui ont pu faire un rattrapage assez rapide ou qui ont par exemple commencé la transition verte ou la transition numérique beaucoup plus rapidement que d'autres. Donc en fait, il y a énormément d'explications, mais encore une fois, c'est très difficile d'avoir des grandes tendances parce qu'il y a plusieurs cas de figure et il y a des morphologies territoriales qui sont tellement différentes. Donc, du coup, on arrive à avoir des grandes tendances. Ce qui est sûr, encore une fois, c'est qu'il faut des politiques, et c'est ce qu'on dit tout le temps, il faut des politiques territoriales, mais ça ne suffit pas. Il faut que les politiques structurelles plus traditionnelles aient cet angle un peu territorialisé. Quand on parle, par exemple, de la politique urbaine, on dit souvent les quartiers en difficulté, tout ce qu'on a mis comme financement pour adresser la question des quartiers en difficulté, et finalement, on n'a pas beaucoup de résultats. On peut aussi dire, si on n'avait pas fait tout ça, peut-être que ça aurait été pire. Et surtout, une politique urbaine qui cible des quartiers ne pourra pas répondre aux enjeux tels que les grandes disparités en termes d'accès aux soins de santé, en termes de niveau d'éducation et d'accès à la formation professionnelle. On voit bien qu'il y a des écarts entre les territoires dans un grand nombre de domaines qui ne sont pas forcément du ressort des politiques territoriales et qui appellent à une approche beaucoup plus territorialisée des politiques structurelles traditionnelles.
Thank you. And right here, please.
Bonjour, j'avais une question par rapport à la France et à Emmanuel Macron qui a prévu de mettre en place des sortes de RER dans les régions. Est-ce que vous pensez que ça pourrait aider à réduire les inégalités en région? Est-ce que c'est une solution pour vous?
Alors, je ne connais pas trop bien les détails de ce dispositif, mais ce que je peux dire, c'est que quand vous dites des RER en région, c'est à l'intérieur des villes en région. OK, ce n'est pas la connexion entre les territoires. Parce que sur la question de la connexion entre les territoires, tout ce qui est en train d'être fait pour réouvrir des lignes, pas mal de lignes ferroviaires, c'est très important. Ça permet de connecter les territoires ruraux aux territoires urbains. Et on voit bien, à travers tous les indicateurs qu'on a à travers les différents pays, on voit bien que la question de la connexion de certains territoires aux zones urbaines et métropolitaines est essentielle. Les zones rurales qui sont plus proches et bien connectées des zones urbaines s'en tirent beaucoup mieux que celles qui sont éloignées. Donc, sur cette question de connexion, c'est très important. Maintenant, à l'intérieur des régions, je ne sais pas de quoi exactement vous parlez, mais il est évident que le RER, c'est un des moyens de répondre à des enjeux de transport public qui sont essentiels dans les métropoles, mais aussi dans les villes moyennes. Et on voit bien que dans certaines villes, et je pense notamment toutes les fameuses 11 core cities, villes-centres du Royaume-Uni, qui ont perdu de la productivité et qui ont accumulé un retard considérable par rapport à Londres, par exemple. L'un des principaux obstacles à la compétitivité de ces 11 métropoles, c'est le problème du transport. Il y a d'autres soucis, mais c'est le transport. Donc, si on renforce et qu'on continue de développer le transport public au sein des régions, enfin, quand vous dites des régions, au sein des métropoles, au sein des villes et même des villes intermédiaires, ça va vraiment dans le bon sens.
Thank you. We have another question from online. Were there particular effects that you saw on regional inequalities due to either the COVID or cost of living crises?
Oh, yes. Of course, of course. From the start of the pandemic, actually, we have been tracking very carefully in the impact of COVID on different territories, on different regions and places. And what we saw is that the impact was, of course, highly asymmetric because the regions were dependent, were specialized sometimes in sectors that were the most affected by lockdown, for instance. And we have seen that this has impacted a lot the rural regions. In terms of health, in the beginning, you remember, it was mainly an urban issue within large cities, but then in the second wave, rural areas, they were much more impacted because the response in terms of healthcare was inappropriate. The tourism regions, the one that were really completely specialized in tourism in Greece, in Portugal, they completely collapsed. So of course, what we saw is that this type of crisis had a strong territorial impact during the first phase, the 3-4 years of the COVID. Now, because of, a lot of, we know that a lot of support were provided to people and firms, unprecedented levels of support help to mitigate this type of inequalities, territorial inequalities over the medium term. However, in certain cases, this type of crisis further fragilize territories that are already fragile, and they have more difficulties in rebounding. And one of the reasons why they had more difficulty in rebounding is, for instance, that during the COVID period, everybody started to work remotely, and all the gaps in access to speed broadband, for instance, in rural areas, did not allow a lot of workers to work remotely in rural regions. So there are this type of gaps in access to digital, in access to healthcare, in access to education, actually did not help those regions that were the most affected to rebound. Fortunately, there were a large scale of support during that period. Now, this was a very specific crisis. I think one of the most important crises to analyze was the global financial crisis, because it was a systemic crisis. And what we have seen, and by the way, most of the inequalities, regional inequalities that I have shown today over the last 20 years, in many countries, actually, they really started to accelerate since the 2008 crisis. And 10 years after the crisis, that is pre-pandemic, just before the pandemic, half of OECD region did not recover the pre-crisis employment level. What does it mean? It means that they were deeply affected, but they did not recover at the same level as before. And the cost of living crisis has affected a lot of regions, again, not in an even way. The rural regions, which depends more on energy, they have less household that have less saving than in metropolitan areas. They need to use more their cars. The manufacturing industry rely more on energy. Therefore, they were particularly hit by the cost of living crisis, especially the energy crisis. But we have to think also about people living in cities, people living in cities, you know, the most vulnerable, have been hugely impacted by the cost of living crisis. So yes, we are tracking very much what is going on. And every time we see that, of course, the impact is largely asymmetric.
Thank you. And dernière question de France TV. Comment les régions peuvent-elles faire face à la transition industrielle?
Okay. So when we speak about industrial transition, of course, we are talking about different subjects behind this word. What we're doing in our work, we are looking, for instance, at the question of those regions that have experienced long-term industrial transition, the one that have been in decline for a long time, and what they have been doing so far to try to find another type of trajectories. And here comes the idea of, you know, having different experiments, having a new strategy, engaging all type of stakeholders in defining the strategy. And we have seen that some of them have been quite successful. Bilbao, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and many others. The other type of industrial transition that we are now, you know, looking at is, of course, the green transition. How to help all type of regions to benefit and participate in the green transition, and make sure that, you know, they can tap all they can reach all type of opportunities from the green transition. And here again, we have different stories. We have seen that, for instance, in rural regions, the one that are trying to specialize, and there is a lot of potential in terms of specializing in renewable energy. On the other hand, you know, it does not create automatically a lot of jobs in the renewable energy, but there is a wide range of activities from the green economy that are completely untapped in rural areas because of a low level of a relatively lower level of entrepreneurship as compared to urban areas due to different reasons. The fact that also in rural areas, you know, to boost innovation, which is a key driver for competitiveness and a key driver to reconcile, you know, with growth trajectories. Problem is that most of the support for innovation in general in countries, they focus on R&D based or technology based, and this goes against, you know, rural regions. Therefore, we are advocating, for instance, to extend innovation support to different type of, to broader type of innovation, social innovation, public sector innovation, but also entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Lamia, and merci à toutes et à tous, and bonne journée. And we hope you'll read more online. Thanks.